What happens when an act of compassion leads to a battle of loyalties? Dive into a story where a woman's choice to save a wounded warrior reignites ancient conflicts and forges an unbreakable bond. She rescued a wounded individual from certain death. The next day his fellow warriors surrounded her dwelling. The relentless sun descended like a divine decree upon the New Mexico terrain, each inhalation grating with dust for the individual moving across it. The heavens were a vast bleached canvas, so glaring it stung her vision, yet her progress remained unwavering. The container swaying at her hip was almost void, holding mere splashes from the nearly desiccated rivulet a mile away. Water for revered principle, a hard-won necessity, never a bestowed comfort. She was halfway to her homestead when she sighted him. Initially, she presumed it was another carcass, perhaps a coyote or some creature not yet fully scavenged by vultures. But then she detected the shallow, ragged movement of a chest. Her pace slackened, her heart lurched within her ribs. He was young, barely past adolescence, his skin the hue of aged copper, dark hair matted to his countenance with coagulated blood, and dirt and arrow shaft protruded from his thigh, fractured near its base. His garment was ripped, revealing sinew and bone. His lips were parched, his eyes shut, crimson fluid stained the dust around him. Dark and congealing, her father's admonition echoed from a long-buried memory. Encounter one of them alone, lass. He's bait, the others are close. But her feet remained rooted. She crouched, slowly gripping the bucket with one hand and pressing the other to his neck. A pulse flickered faint, but present the low sound he emitted as she gently shifted. His head was small, animalistic, not threatening, merely alive. She dipped her hand into the bucket and allowed a few droplets of water to trickle onto his lips. He flinched, then swallowed. His eyelids fluttered. He murmured something unintelligible, not the common tongue, not the Iberian dialect, perhaps a native prayer, perhaps a curse. That was when the equine sounds erupted. The heavy thudding of hooves surged rapidly behind her. 6 horsemen, faces partially obscured by cloth rifles resting low, dust and perspiration clung to their coats. Tucker rode in the vanguard. A man whose voice resonated like coal scraped on metal, and whose disposition was as venomous as a serpent miss. He drawled, reining in. His gaze flicked to the man at her feet. Well, now isn't this a revelation? The woman rose slowly, her body taut. He's perishing. He's a Comanche. Tucker snapped. Slaughtered 2 men near the dry creek, shot them in the back. The scoundrel fled and abandoned his kin. She remained motionless. One of the men guffawed. Let her preserve him. He'll disembowel her before nightfall. Tucker leaned forward in his saddle, his face hardened. You ate him, and you're a betrayer. Might as well stain your face crimson and wield a war axe. Her jaw tight. He's exsanguinating. Then let him. Tucker shifted his rifle. Unless you wish for us to expedite it for you. She met his stare. You raise that weapon again on my property, Tucker, and I swear to God I'll entomb you beside him. The ensuing silence stretched taut and fragile. One of the younger men mumbled, "It's not worth it." Tucker spat into the earth. You were always a simpleton for lost causes. Then he jerked his horse around and galloped away. The others followed. She waited until their dust dissipated. Only then did she sink to her knees beside the young man again. You'd better be worthy, she muttered, tearing cloth from her own garments to bind his leg. Her hands trembled, her breathing quickened, but she labored like one without an alternative. The arrow had to remain for now. She had learned that much when her husband returned with one in his shoulder. He perished regardless, not from the injury, but from the ensuing infection. Confound you, she whispered, as she hoisted him over her shoulder. You weigh more than you appear. Every step homeward was agony. Her back shrieked, her arms quivered, her legs buckled repeatedly, but she pressed on, step by dragging step, until her small dwelling came into view, a squat, sun-baked refuge that had endured longer than her matrimony, longer than her optimism. Inside, she kicked aside the floor covering and opened the cellar hatch. The cool air ascended to greet her like a sigh. I'll lament this, she muttered, gently lowering him into the gloom. But not today. She tossed down a blanket, a tin of balm, and a water skin before securing the hatch. Only when she bolted the trapdoor did her knees give way. She slumped against the wall, lungs burning, fingers raw from blood and splinters. Outside, the wind stirred dust into the yard. Inside, the woman stared at the door, rifle across her lap, and whispered to no one in particular, I hope you survive, warrior, because I just wasted everything I possess on a man. I do not even know the subterranean chamber was dark and cool, redolent of earth and root vegetables, the kind of scent that clung to roots and secrets. The woman lit a small oil lamp and placed it on the floor beside the cot she had previously brought down. The injured man lay motionless save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His skin gleamed with perspiration, streaked with soil and dried blood. The projectile still protruded from his thigh, inflamed and red. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling despite herself. She had boiled water, brought down clean cloth, spirits for cleansing, and thread she hadn't used since the last attempt to mend something that resisted repair. He did not stir as she severed the fabric from around the wound. Only when she poured the potent liquid over the torn flesh did he emit a low groan, a sound midway between anguish and warning. His eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused, and she perceived the untamed quality within them, the primal edge of one who had endured prolonged pursuit. It's all right, she murmured softly, unsure whom she was attempting to reassure. You are safe for now. He offered no reply, not even a blink. She set her jaw and recommenced her task. She could not extract the projectile, yet it would bleed excessively, so she cleaned around it, packed the wound, and bound it as tightly as she dared. Her hands moved with an awkward tenderness, guided more by instinct than proficiency. When it was concluded, she wiped the perspiration from her brow and leaned back on her heels. Her breath labored. Will you speak, she inquired, not anticipating a response, or simply gaze at me, As if I am the one at fault, the man's stare remained unchanged, still wary, still observant. You need not offer thanks, she muttered, just refrain from attempting to end my life. When you regain your feet. That night she slumbered by the trapdoor, the rifle within reach. She convinced herself it was a precaution. She told herself she did not trust him, and that remained largely true. But when she awoke near midnight, the cellar was silent save for a faint whisper, a solitary word repeated in a voice dry and brittle as ancient parchment. Nomi. While she sat up listening, the voice emerged again, soft and low. Nakomi. She did not comprehend its meaning, not the common tongue, not the Iberian dialect, but something about it, about the way he uttered it, caused her heart to slow within her chest. A supplication, perhaps a designation, a memory. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, until slumber finally claimed her. By morning the fever had abated. She descended with a metal cup of broth, and found him awake, his eyes clearer, tracking her movements. He made no attempt to rise, he did not speak, but when she extended the cup his fingers brushed hers, and for the first time he met her gaze without suspicion. He drank slowly. When he finished, he returned the cup with both hands, deliberately, carefully, respectfully. Then he looked at her again, and though no words came, there was something unmistakable in his expression, gratitude. She set the cup aside and folded her arms. You're welcome, she stated. He nodded once. Slowly they sat in silence, two strangers bound by injury and the dust, neither knowing what lay ahead, but both presently alive. The morning light arrived, pale and keen, slicing through the dusty air like a sharpened edge. The woman was stoking the fire in the stove, and she perceived the initial sound, hooves, not one or two, but many, soft, deliberate, not galloping like the prior group. This was a procession, a forewarning. She crossed to the window and peered out. They approached like specters rising from the earth. More than a dozen native horsemen, silent, as the breeze fanned out in a wide circle around her small dwelling. Feathers adorned their hair, rifles were slung low, and war axes gleamed at their hips. They did not shout, they did not draw weapons, but their presence pressed against the world like a tempest poised to break. At the vanguard rode a man older than the others, straight-backed, with a face sculpted by sun. In conflict his braids were streaked with silver, his chest bore faded markings and scars like history inscribed on skin. His eyes were sharp, deeply set, and utterly inscrutable. The leader. He was not merely a chief, he was a reckoning. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She seized the rifle from beside the door, and stepped out slowly, her boots crunching on the parched ground. Her garment fluttered in the breeze, and her mouth felt dry as dust. She kept the rifle lowered but accessible. The circle of warriors remained still, silent. She raised her chin. You came for him. The elder dismounted with the grace of one who had never known flight. He advanced 2 steps, hands empty, but his stare cut like a blade. We came for our blood, he stated, his voice low, imbued with warning. The woman held her ground. You're too late. If you came to inter him. The elder's eyes narrowed. I found him bleeding in the dirt, she continued, maintaining a steady voice, arrow in his leg, half dead from the sun. Your people left him behind. A murmur stirred among the warriors. The elder said nothing. He observed her as a hawk studies prey, contemplating the worth of the descent. I dragged him here, she stated. I cleansed the wound, fed him broth. He's still drawing breath because I disregarded the men who wished him to cease. Still silence. Then from beneath the structure a muffled sound, a low groan, unmistakable. The eyes of every warrior shifted towards the floorboards behind her. The woman did not flinch. He's alive, she declared, but not fit to ride. The elder stepped closer. You detain him like a captive. I tended him like a man, one who would have perished without my intervention. His gaze flicked to her hands, to the edge of the rifle now visible behind her hip. I did him here to barter, she added, and I did not bring him here to possess. Another murmur passed through the warriors, low, uncertain. The elder looked past her towards the roof, the chimney, the smoke that still drifted thin and steady. His fingers flexed at his side, and then he turned to speak in his native tongue. The men responded with nods, curt and slow. The woman could not comprehend the words, but she understood their import. Judgment, debate, suspicion. She watched as the elder stepped back, then lifted his chin. You claim you saved him, he said at last. Then you will oversee him, until he speaks, until he chooses. Her breath caught. She nodded. Once he turned, remounted his steed, and signaled his men. But they did not depart. Instead they dismounted, forming a perimeter, not hostile, not amicable, waiting. They would not leave without their brother. And the woman for the first time realized, she was no longer merely sheltering one individual. She was now positioned in the midst of something far grander than her own fears. The native tribesmen did not leave. They constructed no campfires, but they remained silent silhouettes around the dwelling, like spirits awaiting the reclamation of something lost each night. The woman bolted the doors, though not from terror, not any more. Fear had begun to yield to something more challenging. Uncertainty. On the second morning the elder returned to her threshold. The woman stepped out, rifle at her side, chin held high. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained resolute. He's not prepared to depart. The elder's expression remained unchanged. He is our blood, we care for our own. You abandoned him to die. He elected to engage in battle. He accepted the hazard. The woman swallowed. Perhaps so, but I did not permit him to perish, and I will not allow you to take him merely to conclude what the desert initiated. The elder's gaze sharpened. You believe we slay our wounded. I don't know what you'll do, she stated. It is the crux. The silence between them stretched taut, a testicle. She could discern the conflict flickering in the elder's eyes. Honor, suspicion, pride. At last he gave a curt nod. One more day, he pronounced, then we shall converse again. He turned and walked away, his boots disturbing the dust. The woman exhaled only when he vanished behind the trees. That night she brought a fresh dressing and a bowl of warm water to the cellar. The man was awake, propped slightly on one elbow, his skin pale, But no longer feverish when she knelt beside him, he did not flinch. She dipped the cloth and began unwrapping his thigh. The wound appeared angry, but clear, healing slowly. You possess a stubborn resolve, she muttered, wiping gently. His voice came low, rough. So do you? She blinked at him. English now, he nodded. Once some good. I'm weary of speaking to myself. He managed the faintest smile just at the corner of his mouth. Then, his gaze shifted, searching her face. Why? He inquired. She paused. Why save me? The woman sat back on her heels, allowing the questions to settle between them. After a moment, she stated, you were not a menace, not then. And you were perishing, that sufficed. He studied her. That simple. No. She ran a hand through her hair. But it's the best explanation. I have silence again then. Because something in his eyes made her feel secure enough to disclose it. She added, my husband was killed 5 years ago, not by natives. I don't believe no one truly knew. It was a cattle skirmish, one of those fights, where no one is wrong but everyone bleeds. He looked at her gently. You perceive me as him? She shook her head. I don't perceive anything anymore. I once believed the world was simpler righteous men, and wicked, yours and ours. Now I think we're all just guessing until it's too late. He remained quiet for an extended period. Then he said softly, but clearly, I am not the man who killed your husband. I know. She didn't realize she believed it until the words escaped her lips. Their eyes held not as adversaries, not even as strangers, but as two individuals attempting to communicate through the fissures. Later that night, as she sat at the top of the stairs, with the trapdoor cracked open just enough to listen, she heard his voice again. Nakomi. He whispered into the dark, and this time she whispered back, peace. The dust arrived first, a long tendril of it ascending against the stark blue sky, curling like vapor across the ridge. The woman perceived it just before midday. While gathering fuel near the boundary of her property, she squinted into the distance, her heart clenching as forms began to materialize. Horses, saddles, rifles. Tucker. They had returned. She abandoned the kindling and sprinted towards the cabin, her garments entangling around her knees, her boots thudding on the dry earth. Inside, she slammed the door shut and retrieved the rifle from the wall, her breath already coming in rapid gasps. Then she stepped outside, hands steady, but stomach churning. The riders thundered into her yard like an uninvited tempest, 7 of them, Tucker in the lead. His flushed face gleamed with perspiration and fury, and the others flanked him, rifles poised, eyes gleaming with the anticipation of imminent violence. Well, I'll be damned, Tucker called out, halting his mount. Behold this little frontier sovereign standing tall as if she commands the territory. The woman said nothing. He tilted his head, grinning. Is he still within your spoil of war? She gritted her teeth. Tell me, he sneered, have you become his female yet? Or are you merely keeping him warm until they come to sever your throat in your slumber? The men laughed, coarse and cruel. The woman remained unmoving. Turn around. Tucker, you possess no right to be here. Tucker's smile vanished. We possess every right that's native land out there, but this thighs is ours, and we're not about to permit one of theirs to feign incapacitation here while the rest of them crawl from the undergrowth. He spurred his horse forward a few paces. I heard reports that you're sheltering one, that he's not merely breathing, but conversing. The woman stepped forward, positioning herself squarely in the center of the yard. Depart, she stated. Now I will not issue a second request. One of the men raised his rifle. She's bluffing. A rustle answered from the trees behind the cabin. Beside the barn, among the brush, silent movement, purposeful. The elders' warriors had not left. They emerged from the edge of the woods like phantoms, rifles raised, but not aimed, watching, surrounding, waiting. Tucker stiffened. Well, look at that. They didn't flee. Brave little creatures, aren't they? The tension in the air drew taut as a wire. The woman's voice cut through it. I will not permit blood to spill on my land, unless I am granted no other alternative. Tucker turned his glare on her. You truly chose your allegiance, didn't you? I didn't choose an allegiance, she snapped. I chose to preserve a life. You came here to extinguish one. He laughed once bitterly. You sound precisely like my spouse. Before she absconded with a preacher, the elder stepped out from behind the cabin, walking slowly, but without apprehension. His warriors fanned wider. No one spoke. They had no need to. Tucker's hand dropped to his holster. The woman's rifle rose before he could draw. Her voice cracked like a whip. Try it, I dare you. Tucker stared at her. The wind intensified. A loose shudder slapped against the cabin wall like a heartbeat. You aiming that at me? He said quieter. Now I'm aiming it at the man who decides to make me excavate another grave in dry earth. They stood like that for a long, agonizing moment. Behind her, the injured man appeared in the doorway, pale, limping, but upright. He said nothing, but the sight of him sent a tremor through Tucker's ranks. Not a phantom, not a corpse, a man who defied death. Tucker spat into the dust. This isn't concluded. No, the woman said. But perhaps it never should have begun. He turned his horse, snarling, one day, girl, you'll regret not letting him bleed. The other men rode off in a storm of hooves and dust. When the air cleared, the woman lowered her rifle slowly. The elder stepped beside her, his eyes unreadable. You fight for him, he stated. She turned to look at the man who stood behind her, steadying himself on the door frame. I fight for peace, she asserted. But if I must stand between both factions with a weapon to maintain it, then so be it. The elder gave a slight nod, not approval, not commendation, recognition. The woman had transformed into something else now, not merely a settler, not merely a female. She was a boundary, a line no one dared traverse lightly. It commenced with a sound like the fracture of bone, sharp, sudden, final. A gunshot reverberated through the stillness, echoing off the rocks like thunder. For a split second no one stirred. The world held its breath. Then chaos ripped it wide open. Smoke erupted from the muzzle of a frontiersman's rifle, and the bullet struck the ground inches from the elder's feet. The warriors responded without hesitation. They moved like wind and fire, spreading through the brush with terrifying coordination. Rifles, barked, horses reared, the air filled with shouts, gunfire, and the scream of dust-choked wind. The woman had no time to deliberate. She dropped to her knees behind the woodpile beside the cabin, loaded her rifle with trembling hands, and pressed it tight against her shoulder. The crack of gunfire around her was deafening, but she could still discern the voices, men shouting her name, branding her a traitor, demanding surrender. None of it mattered, not anymore. She caught sight of the man near the doorway, gripping the wall for balance. He was still frail, favoring his wounded leg, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Blood had roused him back to life. The woman raised her head and fired. A frontiersman ducked. Too late, his hat flew off as her shot tore through the brim. She ducked back as return fire split the air above her, biting into the wood and sending splinters into her face. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, smearing dust and blood to her left. The elder led a flanking charge, directing warriors with hand signals, his voice low and urgent. The tribesmen moved as one, flashing between cover rifles raised fearless. The woman did not comprehend their tongue, but she had no need to. Their conflict was a language unto itself. Then a sudden cry rang out sharp, close. The woman turned just in time to see a frontiersman break from the trees, rifle leveled at the man's exposed side. She scrambled to her feet, heart hammering, and fired without aiming. The shot slammed into the man's shoulder. He spun, dropping his weapon as he fell hard to the ground. The woman stood frozen, smoke curling from her rifle barrel. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands trembled. The man stared at her, not in fear, not in anger, but in something deeper, recognition. She had drawn blood in his defense. There was no retreating now. Another shot rang out, this one closer. The woman ducked, pain lancing across her upper arm, a graze not deep, but enough to knock her sideways into the dust. Before she could raise a shadow, moved swiftly beside her the man. He crawled towards her, dragging his injured leg, one arm bracing his body outstretched towards her rifle. His chest heaved, sweat and blood staining the fabric of his shirt, but his eyes never left her. She handed him the weapon. Together they pressed against the wall of the cabin. He loaded, aimed, and fired steady. Practiced. The rifle bucked in his hands. The woman watched him work, watched the pain twist his face, and the fire in his eyes refused to dim. This was no adversary, no myth, just a man fighting for breath, for survival. For her gunfire surged again as the frontiersman pushed forward. Another warrior cried out, dropping behind the fence. A horse bolted riderless. The woman reloaded, teeth gritted, and fired again. They fought side by side, two against many, neither retreating. Eventually the tide shifted. The frontiersman faltered, one dropped his rifle and ran. Another cursed and pulled his wounded comrade from the fray. Tucker, bleeding from his shoulder, shouted something incoherent and disappeared into the trees. And just like that it ended. Smoke curled through the air, hot and bitter. The dust settled, silence fell. The woman sat in the dirt, panting. Blood oozed from her arm, her dress was torn, her face streaked with sweat and soot. The man slumped beside her, his chest rising in shallow breaths. But alive, she looked at him. He looked back. No words passed between them, none were needed. She had crossed a line today, not by accident, not by circumstance, but by choice. With powder on her hands and fire in her chest, she had claimed her place, not with one people or the other, but with the truth that no one owned her. The man reached for her hand, slow, tentative. She didn't flinch. Their fingers met in blood and dust, and held. The battleground lay quiet now. Smoke drifted in low ribbons across the sunlit yard, curling through broken fences and the scorched wood of the porch. Empty shell casings glinted in the dirt. The wind carried the sharp tang of gunpowder and blood. Tucker and his men were gone, those who could still ride anyway. The rest had crawled or been carried, leaving behind wounded pride and spent bullets. None had the stomach for a second round. The woman sat slumped beneath the cottonwood tree near the well, legs stretched out, her arm wrapped in a strip of her own torn petticoat. Blood oozed through the cloth, but the pain was dull now. Far away, her chest still heaved with every breath. She had survived, but she didn't feel victorious. The elder approached her slowly, his boots crunching over cracked earth. He stood over her, casting a long shadow in the dying light. His expression was unreadable. You fight like a native warrior, he stated. The woman let out a shaky laugh. I don't know what I fight like anymore. The elder crouched, his eyes sharp, but not cruel. You know what comes next. She met his gaze. Mormon, more weapons. He nodded. Your people will not forgive this, not soon, not ever. I never sought their forgiveness. The elder tilted his head. They will brand you a traitor, an outcast. I've been called worse, she stated, by better men. The elder's lips twitched at the corners, almost a smile. Then he rose to his full height, looking beyond her to the edge of the woods, where the warriors waited, already preparing to move, always ready to vanish into the land that had never betrayed them. The man approached from behind, limping, but with more strength in each step than before. He carried her rifle slung over one shoulder. His garment was torn, dirt and blood caking his skin, yet in his eyes was something unbroken. He knelt beside her, slow and deliberate, and then without a word he reached for her hand. His touch was careful, reverent, his fingers calloused and rough closed around hers with a gentleness that undid her. The woman swallowed hard. No one emerges from a fire unscathed, he murmured. His voice was soft, low. No one survives whole. She didn't speak, but he continued. You lived, and you kept me living. They sat like that for a moment, hands clasped, heads bowed together, not in defeat, but in understanding. The elder stepped forward again, arms crossed. You have no home now, he stated. She looked up at him, tired, but calm. Perhaps I never did. He studied her for a long beat, then his voice dropped, heavy with meaning. Come with us. She blinked what he nodded toward the trees. Leave this place, your people, their conflict. Come west, live where law does not pursue, and blood still signifies something. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't pity, it was an invitation, a way out or a way forward. She looked at the man who still held her hand. He didn't plead, he didn't ask, but in his eyes was something steady, true, a vow, not in words. In being, she thought of the house behind her, splintered, scorched, hollowed, of the grave she'd already dug, of the quiet ache in her chest that had been loneliness too long to name. She rose slowly to her feet, gripping the man's arm for balance. All right, she stated, no ceremony, no conditions, just the truth. They would depart together, not as prisoner and savior, not as settler and warrior, but as two. Individuals who had earned each other through fire and still stood. The morning was pale and golden when the woman swung into the saddle one last time. The cabin stood behind her, scarred, smoke-stained, its windows dark and empty. The place that had once been her entire world now looked small, hollow, like something shed and left behind. She didn't look back, not truly. Her eyes passed over the roofline, the battered porch, the tree with the rope swing long gone to rot. Then she turned her gaze forward. The man rode beside her, his legs still recovering, but stronger now, his back straight, his eyes on the horizon. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The air between them was full of what had been communicated in gunfire and silence, and the grip of a hand when the world threatened to end. The native warriors moved in loose formation, slipping through the low canyons and brush like wind over rock. They didn't ride fast. This was not a retreat, it was a return. The woman followed, dust rising in soft spirals from her horse's hooves. Her hands were raw from the reins, her muscles sore from days of conflict and sleepless nights. Heaviness in her, only the clean ache of effort, of choice. The land transformed as they traveled. The flat plains yielded to broken hills, then to winding trails beneath thick stands of pine and sandstone towers. The farther they rode, the quieter the world became. No more gunfire, no more accusations, just wind and hoofbeats, and the occasional hawk circling far above. By dusk, they reached a narrow ravine flanked by stone. In silence the warriors dismounted, moving with the calm of men who knew they would not be pursued here. A fire was built, not large, just enough for warmth. The group sat in a loose ring, eating in silence. The woman remained slightly apart, watching the flames dance, her thoughts slow and quiet. The man approached after the meal, crouching beside her. He held something in his palm, a small adornment crafted of polished, bone-red stone and tightly woven sinew. He did not speak, he did not have to. She stared at it for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. It was not a band, not a promise carved in stone or sealed in a sacred building, but it held deeper meaning. It was the kind of pledge forged only in survival. Blood and dust, in quiet protection and trust earned without soliciting. He reached forward and tied it gently around her neck. The touch was soft, reverent. She placed her hand over the pendant, then over his hand. Their eyes met. That was all. No embrace, no celebration, just the steady rhythm of something real. Later that night she lay wrapped in a blanket beneath a sky full of stars, so sharp they looked like shards of ice beside her. The man slept on one elbow, watching the fire fade, and the woman knew she was not fleeing anymore, not from her sorrow, not from her past, not from the faces who would brand her a traitor. She had chosen this, chosen him. They had not survived to revert to what was, they had survived to construct what could be. And out here in the silence between stars and the wilderness, where designations no longer mattered, that was enough, more than enough. It was affection, and it required no sanction. Out here survival is earned, affection is not guaranteed, and peace is a choice made one step at a time. The woman did not ride back to the world that had betrayed her. She rode forward toward a future that did not concern itself with her origins, only with who she chose to become. And the man, he did not need to articulate his feelings, he demonstrated them in silence, in fidelity, in firelight and bone.